In the annals of history, few deaths reveal the corruption of power as starkly as that of Lucius Annaeus Seneca, a man who taught an emperor wisdom on Leto. Die by that same emperor's command in a ritual of calculated cruelty. This is C.S.'s story of how Rome's greatest Stoic philosopher was forced to demonstrate his teachings in the most final way possible, bleeding out slowly while lecturing on virtue as his former student. Watched from afar, it is a tale that exposes the brutal reality behind the marble facades of imperial Rome, where even the most respected minds could be snuffed out on a tyrant's whim. Lucius Annaeus Seneca was born around 4 B.C.E. in Córdoba, modern-day Spain, into a wealthy equestrian family that prized education and rhetoric. His father, Seneca the elder, was a renowned teacher of oratory, and young Lucius inherited both intellectual gifts and social connections that would shape his destiny. Moving to Rome, as a Hoth, Seneca immersed himself in philosophy, particularly Stoicism, which taught that virtue was the only true good and that one should accept fate with rational detachment. This philosophical foundation would prove both his greatest strength and ultimately his death warrant. Seneca's early career flourished under Emperor Claudius, where his skills as an orator and writer earned him a seat in the Senate and considerable wealth. However, his life took a dramatic turn in 41 CE. He was accused of adultery with Julia Livilla, Caligula's sister, and exiled to the desolate island of Corsica for 8 long years. Seneca lived in isolation, writing philosophical treatises and letters that would later become classics of Stoic literature. Isexel taught him profound lessons about powerlessness and acceptance that would later inform his teachings to a young prince who desperately needed such wisdom. In 49 CE, Seneca's fortunes reversed dramatically when the younger, now emperor, Claudius's wife recalled him from exile to serve as tutor to her 12-year-old son. Nero Agrana recognized that Seneca's reputation for wisdom and his Stoic philosophy could provide the moral foundation her son would need to rule justly. Seneca accepted this monumentalis benebi, believing he could shape a future emperor who would embody philosophical virtue and restore dignity to Roman governance. Little did he know, he was signing his own eventual death warrant. The relationship between Seneca and young Nero began with genuine promise and mutual respect. Seneca found in Nero a quick-witted student who showed aptitude for poetry, music, and rhetoric, even if he seemed less interested in the harder disciplines of philosophy and statecraft. Nero, for his part, admired his tutor's vast learning and worldly experience hanging on his words, as Seneca explained the principles of Stoic virtue, justice, courage, and appearance, and wisdom. These early years of instruction took place in the luxurious imperial palaces, where Seneca attempted to ground his student in moral principles, even as they were surrounded by the intoxicating trappings of absolute power. Seneca's influence extended beyond mere tutoring when Nero, emperor, at age 16, in 54 CE, following Claudius's suspicious death. Young emperor's principal advisor, Seneca wielded enormous behind-the-scenes power, effectively acting as co-ruler. Alongside Sextus Afranius Barus, the Taurian priest, they managed the early years of Nero's reign with remarkable success, implementing policies that promoted justice, reduced government corruption, and expanded citizens' rights. These first 5 years, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, were later remembered as a golden age of good governance, largely due to Seneca's moderating influence on his imperial pupil. However, Seneca began to notice troubling changes in Nero's character as the young emperor Macordon felt the intoxicating effects of unlimited power. The philosophical discussions about virtue and self-control gave way to conversations about entertainment, luxury, and the divine nature of imperial authority. Nero showed increasing impatience with the restraints his advisors placed on his desires, particularly regarding his wish to perform publicly as an actor and charioteer, pursuits considered beneath the dignity of a Roman emperor. Seneca watched with growing alarm as his student began to embrace the very vices he had been taught to reject. The first major crack in their relationship came in 55 CE, when Nero ordered the murder of Britannicus, Claudius's biological son and potential rival for the throne. Seneca had counseled all against this action, arguing that true security came from justice and virtue, not from eliminating perceived threats. But Nero, influenced by his mother, Agrana, and his own paranoid instincts, ignored his tutor's advice and had the 14-year-old Britannicus poisoned at a dinner party. The casual brutality of this act and Nero's apparent lack of remorse marked the beginning of Seneca's gradual loss of influence over his former student. As Nero's confidence grew, so did his resentment of those who had guided his youth, particularly his mother, Agrana, and his tutor. Seneca, the emperor, began to view their continued presence as an implicit criticism of his judgment and a limitation on his freedom to rule as he pleased. Seneca found himself increasingly isolated in imperial councils. His advice sought less frequently, and heeded even more rarely the philosophical principles he had worked so hard to instill in Nero. were being systematically abandoned in favor of a more autocratic and self-indulgent approach to governance that prioritized emperor's personal desires over the welfare of the state. By 59 CE, Nero's transformation from philosopher king to tyrant became complete with the murder of his own mother, Agrippa. When subtle attempts to eliminate her through staged accidents failed, Nero finally direct assassination, sending soldiers to her villa to complete the deed. Seneca, horrified by this matricide, realized that his former student had become precisely the kind of ruler he had helped to prevent through his teachings. The young man who had once eagerly absorbed lessons about virtue and self-control had become a monster capable of killing his own mother to secure his power. The death of Agrippa marked a turning point in Seneca's own position at court. No longer able to influence Nero toward virtue and increasingly disgusted by the emperor's actions, Seneca began to withdraw from active participation in government. He requested permission to retire from public life multiple times, citing his advanced age and desire to on philosophical writing. However, Nero consistently refused these requests, perhaps sensing that allowing Seneca to leave would be seen as an admission that this reign had lost its moral foundation. The philosopher found himself trapped in a gilded cage, complicit by association with increasingly heinous acts he was powerless to prevent. Seneca's wealth, accumulated during his years of political influence, became another source of tension with Nero. The emperor, suspicious of potential rivals, began to view his former tutor's vast riches as a possible threat to his own security. Critics at court whispered that Seneca had used his position to enrich himself at the state's expense, and that this continued wealth and influence made him a natural focal point for any conspiracy against the emperor. These whispers found fertile ground in Nero's increasingly paranoid mind. Already predisposed to see threats everywhere, as his grip on power became more tenuous, the situation deteriorated further. With the emergence of the Pisonian conspiracy in 65 CE, a wide-ranging plot to assassinate Nero and replace him with Calpurnius Piso, a respected senator known for his traditional Roman values, the conspiracy attracted numerous senators, knights, and even some Taurian guardsmen who had grown disgusted with Nero's excesses and his abandonment of Roman traditions in favor of Greek-style performances and luxury. While the historical evidence for Seneca's direct involvement remains ambiguous, his philosophical opposition to tyranny, and his known desire to retire from public life, made him a natural suspect in Nero's paranoid imagination. The conspiracy was betrayed by one of its own members, and Nero's response was swift and brutal mass arrests swept through Rome's elite as the emperor sought to root out all potential threats to his rule. Under torture, some conspirators named Seneca as a supporter, or at least a sympathizer with their cause, though these confessions were likely extracted under extreme duress and may not have reflected reality. What mattered was not the truth of Seneca's involvement, but Nero's perception. Athos' former mentor represented a continuing threat to his authority and legitimacy. Seneca's reputation for virtue and wisdom made him particularly dangerous in Nero's eyes, as it provided a stark contrast to the emperor's own moral degradation. The philosopher's very existence served as a living reminder of what Nero had been taught to become and how far he had fallen from those ideals. Moreover, Seneca's vast network of students, admirers, and correspondents throughout the empire created a potential alternative power structure of thought could challenge Nero's authority. The emperor concluded that his former teacher had to die, not necessarily based of specific treasonous acts, but because his continued existence was incompatible with Nero's vision of absolute rule. In the spring of 65 CE, Nero made his decision rather than face the potential embarrassment of a public trial where Seneca might defend himself eloquently and expose the emperor's own failings. Nero chose the more expedient path of forced suicide. This method had the advantage of allowing both parties to maintain some dignity. Seneca could die as a Roman gentleman, taking responsibility for his alleged crimes, while Nero could avoid the awkwardness of publicly executing his former mentor. It was a typically Roman solution that preserved appearances while achieving the emperor's murderous goals. The death warrant came in the form of a centurion's visit to Seneca's villa outside Rome, where the philosopher was spending his retirement years in contemplation and writing. The soldier's message was brief and final. The emperor had lost confidence in Seneca's loyalty and ordered him to take his own life. There would be no trial, no opportunity for defense, no chance for reconciliation. The student had passed final judgment on his teacher, and the sentence was death by suicide, the traditional Roman punishment for high treason. Among the aristocratic class, Seneca received the news with the stoic composure that had characterized his philosophy throughout his life. According to the historian Tacitus, who provides our most detailed account of these events, the philosopher showed no surprise or fear upon hearing Nero's command. He had long anticipated that his association with the imperial court would eventually prove fatal, and he had prepared himself mentally for this moment through decades of philosophical reflection on the nature of death and the importance of dying well. The man who had taught others about accepting fate with rational detachment now faced the ultimate test of his own teachings. What followed was one of the most documented and philosophically significant suicides in ancient history, as Seneca transformed his forced death into a final lesson on Stoic virtue and the proper way to face mortality. Surrounded by his wife, Pompeia, close friends, and several scribes who recorded his final words, Seneca began the process of dying with the same deliberate care he had brought to his philosophical writings. He requested that his will be brought to him so he could make final provisions for his household and followers, but the centurion refused Nero's orders to expedite the process and prevent any final political statements. Denied the opportunity to leave a formal testament, Seneca instead bequeathed to his assembled friends what he called his most precious possession, the pattern of his life and the example of his death. He spoke calmly about the importance of facing adversity with courage and rational acceptance, drawing on decades of philosophical study to find meaning in his final moments. His words, preserved by those present and later recorded by historians, provide a unique window into the mind of a man consciously applying Stoic principles while under the ultimate pressure of impending death. The actual process of suicide began when Seneca, following Roman custom, opened thivens in his wrists with a sharp knife. As his blood began to flow, he continued to speak with his friends about philosophy, virtue, and the nature of a good death. His wife, Paulina determined die alongside her husband, also opened her veins, but Seneca convinced her to live on and preserve his memory. The scene as described by Tacitus was both horrifying and inspiring. An elderly man bleeding to death while delivering philosophical lectures with the same calm authority he had once used to instruct an emperor. However, Seneca's advanced age and lean physique meant that his blood flowed too slowly to bring quick death. As hours passed, Onda's strength ebbed. Without achieving the release he sought, the philosopher resorted to additional measures. He cut veins in his ankles and behind his knees, seeking to increase the flow of blood, but even this proved insufficient. The irony was cruel. The man who had spent his life teaching about the importance of accepting fate found his own body stubbornly refusing to release him from his imperial torment, growing weaker but still conscious. Seneca called for poison, likely hemlock, in the tradition of Socrates. Another philosopher, forced to die for his principles, he drank the toxic brew without hesitation, viewing it as simply another step in the process of fulfilling his obligation to die well. Yet even the poison failed to work quickly enough, perhaps because his weakened circulation could not distribute it effectively throughout his body. The prolonged nature of his death added an element of additional suffering that seemed to mock his philosophical composure, though witnesses reported that never lost his dignity or complained about his fate. Finally, as his completely but death still eluded him, Seneca was carried to a steam bath where the hot, humid air was intended to suffocate him and end his prolonged agony. This final method proved effective, and the great philosopher died in the steam-filled chamber, his last breaths taken in an environment that seemed to symbolize the suffocating nature of life under Nero's tyranny. The man who hadn't walked freely through the palaces of power died, trapped in a small hot room, gasping for air that would never come. News of Seneca's death reached Nero quickly, and the emperor's reaction revealed much about his character and his relationship with his former mentor. There, than expressing regret or sorrow for the loss of a man who had devoted years to his education and guidance, Nero reportedly showed relief that a potential threat had been eliminated. Some sources suggest he even it's a chat that Seneca had died in such a prolonged and uncomfortable manner, viewing it as appropriate punishment for what he perceived as betrayal and ingratitude. Nero's treatment of Seneca's memory proved equally vindictive. The emperor ordered that the philosopher's vast wealth be confiscated and his philosophical writings suppressed, though this latter command proved largely ineffective, given the widespread circulation of Seneca's works throughout the empire. Many of Seneca's friends and students were also targeted for persecution, as Nero sought to eliminate any lingering influence of his former teachers' philosophical and political legacy. The emperor seemed determined not just to kill Seneca, but to erase any memory of the moral standards he had once represented. The broader Roman elite watched these proceedings with a mixture of horror and resignation, recognizing that if someone of Seneca's stature and former close nesto, the emperor, could be so casually destroyed, none of them were safe. The death of the philosopher marked a clear escalation in Nero's war against traditional Roman values and the educated classes who upheld them. It sent a chilling message that learning, virtue, and moral authority were not protections against imperial wrath, but rather potential death sentences in a regime that valued only absolute submission to emperors. Will the detailed accounts of Seneca's death, primarily preserved by the historian Tacitus, provide an unusually intimate portrait of how a Stoic philosopher faced his final test. Tacitus, writing several decades of Tacitus events, likely drew on testimonies from those who witnessed Seneca's death, including his disciples and household. Members who survived the purges that followed these accounts emphasized the philosopher's consistency in applying his teachings even under the most extreme circumstances, maintaining his commitment to rational analysis and moral instruction. Until his final breath, contemporary reactions to Seneca's death were necessarily muted given the dangerous political climate under Nero's rule. However, private letters and later historical accounts suggest that maniacal Romans were horrified by the casual brutality with which the emperor disposed of his former mentor. The death was seen not just as the elimination of a political rival, but as an attack on the very idea that wisdom and virtue deserved respect and protection in Roman society. It represented a fundamental breakdown in the traditional relations between knowledge and power that had long characterized the best spirits of Roman governance. The manner of Seneca's death also raised troubling questions about the nature of forced suicide in Roman society. While the practice was theoretically designed to preserve honor and allow dignified exit from impossible situations, Seneca's sprawling suffering revealed the cruel reality behind this supposedly civilized institution. The gap between the ideal of noble self-sacrifice and the messy, painful reality of dying created a powerful symbol of the corruption that had infected Roman political life. Under Nero's rule, in the immediate aftermath of Seneca's death, his philosophical works faced attempted suppression by Nero's regime, but they proved too widely distributed and too highly valued to be completely eliminated. Private copies circulated secretly among educated Romans, and his letters and essays continued to be studied by those seeking guidance on how to live virtuously under tyrannical rule. The dramatic circumstances of his death, far from discrediting his philosophy, valid his teachings about the importance of maintaining dignity and rational composure in the face of adversity. Seneca's influence extended far beyond his immediate historical period, shaping later philosophical and literary traditions throughout the Western world. Early Christian thinkers found in his Stoic teachings a bridge between pagan philosophy and Christian ethics, while Renaissance humanists discarded his works as guides to moral living in complex political environments. The image of the wise count, destroyed by his tyrannical pupil, became a powerful archetype in literature and political thought, influencing works from Shakespeare to modern political philosophy. The relationship between Seneca and Nero also became a cautionary tale about the limits of education and moral instruction in the face of absolute power. Despite years of careful philosophical training, Nero had ultimately rejected his teacher's wisdom in favor of his own destructive impulses. This failure raised profound questions about human nature and the possibility of creating just rulers through predication, questions that continue to resonate in modern discussions about leadership, power, and moral responsibility in political life. Seneca's death proved to be a harbinger of the broader collapse that would soon engulf Nero's regime. The emperor's increasing paranoia and brutality alienated not just the educated elite, but also the military commanders and governors whose loyalty was essential to imperial stability. The purges that followed the Pisonian conspiracy created a climate of fear that ultimately undermined the very security they were meant to protect, as potential opponents realized that submission offered no guarantee of safety under Nero's rule. Within 3 years of Seneca's death, Nero's own end came through suicide as military revolts and political opposition made his position untenable. The emperor, who had forced his teacher to demonstrate Stoic principle through death, was ultimately compelled to apply those same principles himself, though with far less dignity and philosophical composure. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers who saw in Nero's desperate final moments a vindication of Seneca's teachings about inevitable consequences of abandoning virtue for power. The broader Roman Empire survived Nero's fall, but the precedent he set for imperial tyranny would echo through subsequent centuries of Roman history. The casual destruction of respected figures like Seneca became a recurring pattern under later emperors, contributing to the gradual erosion of the moral and intellectual foundations that had once made Rome great. The relationship between philosophy and power, so carefully cultivated during the Republic and early Empire, never fully recovered from the damage inflicted during Nero's reign. The story of Seneca's forced suicide raises enduring questions about the relationship between wisdom and power that remain relevant to modern audiences. How should moral advisors respond when their counsel is ignored or rejected? By hosts and authority, what obligations do teachers have to their students, and what responsibilities do students bear to their mentors? These questions become particularly acute in political contexts where the stakes involve not just personal relationships but the welfare of entire societies. Seneca's death also illuminates the fundamental tension between philosophical ideals and political realities that continues to challenge ethical thinkers today. His Stoic teachings emphasized acceptance of fate and the importance of virtue regardless of external circumstances. Yet this forced suicide resulted directly from his involvement in the very political system. His philosophy claimed to transcend this paradox suggests the difficulty, perhaps, impossibility of maintaining moral purity while engaging with the corrupting influences of power and wealth. The detailed accounts of Seneca's final hours provide a unique study in how philosophical principles function. Under extreme pressure, his ability to maintain composure and continue teaching, even while bleeding to death, demonstrates both the power and the limitations of rational thought in the face of mortality. Whether his example represents heroic consistency or tragic delusion remains a matter of interpretation that each reader must resolve, according to their own understanding of wisdom, courage, and the proper response to injustice. Today, nearly 2,000 years after his death, Seneca remains a compelling figure whose life and death continue to generate scholarly debate and popular interest. His extensive philosophical writings ensure his immortality as a thinker, while the dramatic circumstances of his forced suicide guarantee his place in historical memory as a symbol of intellectual integrity under pressure. The image of the elderly philosopher lecturing on virtue while his blood drains away has become an enduring representation of the conflict between wisdom and power modern readers approaching Seneca's story must grapple with the complexities and contradictions that characterize both his life and his philosophical teachings. He was simultaneously an advocate for simple living and one of the wealthiest men in Rome, a teacher of Stoic detachment who remained deeply involved in political affairs, and a counselor of virtue who served under increasingly corrupt rulers. These contradictions do not invalidate his philosophical insights, but they do complicate any simple assessment of his legacy and the lessons his life might afford to contemporary audiences. The enduring power of Seneca's story lies not in its provision of easy answers about how to live, but in its honest portrayal of the difficult choices for thoughtful people in morally complex situations. His death reminds us that even the wisest and most principled individuals cannot escape the consequences of living in corrupt societies, and that the pursuit of virtue often requires sacrifices that few are prepared to make in our own age of political and moral uncertainty. Seneca's unshakable continues to challenge us to consider what principles we would be willing to die for, and how we might maintain our integrity in the face of overwhelming pressure to compromise our deepest values. The blood that flowed from Seneca's veins in that Roman villa millennia ago carried with it marathon the life of one man. It symbolized the death of an ideal that wisdom could tame power, that education could civilize tyranny, and that virtue could protect virtuous, enforcing his mentor to suicide. Nero didn't just eliminate a political threat, he severed the bond between learning and leadership that had been one of Rome's greatest achievements. The steam that finally suffocated the great philosopher seems to rise still from the pages of history, a reminder of how quickly the civilized world can descend into barbarity when power is divorced from accountability, and wisdom is viewed as weakness rather than strength. Perhaps this is Seneca's greatest lesson, that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against those who would destroy it from within, and that sometimes the most profound teachings come not from what we say in life, but from how courageously we face our deaths.